Tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about mental health in the church setting. One of the things we're going to look at is what mental illness is. Some statistics surrounding that in the U.S. and the impact this has on life in the U.S. And then we'll move on to looking at statistics in the church and the impact on pastors and church members, families of people with mental illness, and then the church's response. So what is an acute mental illness? A definition from the National Institute of Mental Health says an acute mental illness is a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that does not include developmental or substance use disorders, that is diagnosable currently or within the past year, and it's lasted a sufficient amount of time to meet the diagnostic criteria set forth in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM-4 or the DSM-5. The statistics around mental health in the U.S. are really kind of overwhelming. We look at this, some numbers that we got from the National Alliance on Mental Illness shows that approximately 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. experiences a mental illness in a given year. And then we're looking at youth, which is ages 13 to 18. Approximately 1 in 5 of that age group will experience a severe mental illness in their lifetime. Then we move on from there and looking at how substance use disorders play out in relation to mental illness. Excuse me. In looking at the 20.2 million people in the U.S. with substance use disorders, one of the things that we find is that more than half of them have a co-occurring mental illness. That is a staggering number of people with both substance use disorders and a mental illness. These statistics are from the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And then looking at the National Institute of Mental Health, that we find some statistics from 2015 that show that 17.9% of all adults in the U.S. have a mental illness. As you can imagine, with numbers like that, this would have a huge impact on this country. And just in terms of financial cost to the country as a whole, we're looking at more than $193 billion in lost earnings every year. Then looking at mood disorders. Now, mood disorders would include things like major depressive disorder, dysthymic disorder, and bipolar disorder. We're looking at those three. Those are the third most common cause of hospitalization for youth and adults aged 18 to 44. And then one last sobering statistic here, talking about children who've died by suicide in the U.S. More than 90% of children who've died from suicide in the U.S. have a mental health condition. This is from the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and this is a very, very sobering number, which says that the suicide epidemic in this country is a mental health epidemic. So what do we do with these numbers? We want to look at how this applies in the church setting. So in order to do this, we looked at a study commissioned by Lifeway Research where they interviewed, mostly phone interviewed, with a bunch of pastors, church members with mental illness, and family members of church members who had mental illness. And so we're looking at the statistics, we're looking at the perspectives of the pastor and the perspectives of family members, and the church's response, and then the church's responsibility. So one of the things that we learn is that 74% of pastors indicate that they personally know one or more people diagnosed with clinical depression. And 59% of pastors indicate that they've counseled one or more people who were eventually diagnosed with an acute mental illness. Now, I would guess that the numbers are actually higher, but they may not know that these people that they counseled were eventually diagnosed. And then another statistic that is equally telling of how difficult it is as a pastor is that 23% of pastors indicated that they personally struggled with mental illness of some kind. So now we want to move on and look at the experiences of church members from their perspective of dealing with mental illness while in a church setting. So we look at family members of people that have an acute mental illness, and they want churches to talk openly about mental illness to remove the stigma. And yet we find that in the same study that only 49% of pastors rarely or never speak to their church about mental illness. So it's a huge problem, and pastors aren't talking about it. Actually, 1 in 5 pastors and individuals with acute mental illness and fewer family members don't even know the role of how psychological therapy would play out. So what is the church's response? Well, what was found is that 10% of individuals with an acute mental illness indicated that they had changed churches because of the church's response to their mental illness, which is really kind of sad. 75% of church members in a household of someone with acute mental illness say that their church was supportive. So that's a good number. And then a bunch of numbers here regarding the church's responsibility to provide resources. 56% of pastors, 46% of family members, and 39% of individuals with the mental illness strongly agreed that local churches should be responsible to provide local resources for them. But then, again, we'll go back to the statistic of pastors need to say more. 65% of family members in churches, in a household of someone with a mental illness, believe that local churches should do more talking about mental illness openly so that the topic is not taboo. So what is the church's responsibility here? Well, we're looking at, in the Old Testament, God says, I am the Lord, I'm your healer. This is from Exodus 15:26. And in the New Testament, Jesus proclaimed, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the captives to be released and the blind to see, that the oppressed will be set free. So we know that Jesus came to heal. He's the great physician. He wants to heal those that are hurting, the broken, the blind, to set the captives free. And this is a direct description of what people dealing with mental illness are. They're hurting and broken and blind. Mental illness in the church is a very current need. Statistics to the church are very similar to those we see in society, and pastors need to address the subject so that this subject of mental illness in the church and in life as a whole is taboo, is not seen as something that we don't talk about. Thank you.